Mary Thompson had lived at Rosefield home for the elderly for 6 years. A quiet woman in her late 80s, she rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, her words were measured, almost rehearsed. She wore her hair in the same tight bun every morning, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders even in summer, and always carried her knitting bag. Her room was small but neat, decorated with faded photographs in mismatched frames. Most showed children, some smiling, some mid-laugh, one even caught mid-tantrum. Names weren't written on the backs. No one ever came to visit, not during holidays, not on birthdays. The staff grew used to her solitary ways. They assumed the photos were of grandchildren who had long since drifted away, as many do. But Mary wasn't bitter. Each morning after breakfast, she'd retreat to the sunroom and take up her seat by the window, the one that looked out onto the courtyard where birds gathered. She'd pull out her needles and begin to knit. Not scarves, not sweaters, but blankets. Meticulously crafted, full-size blankets. Colorful, patterned, each one completely unique. Over the years, the pile of finished blankets in her room grew so tall that the staff had to start storing them in the back closet. When someone asked what they were for, she'd just smile softly and say, "They're not ready yet." And that was it. No one pressed her. Everyone at Rosefield had their routines, their coping rituals. Knitting blankets seemed harmless enough. What the staff didn't know was that each blanket had a story. Each one was meant for someone. And Mary, though she rarely said anything out loud, remembered every detail of the life that inspired the pattern in her hands. She remembered the time her youngest grandson had scraped his knee on the sidewalk and had cried for 20 minutes, only to break into a smile the moment she handed him a lollipop. She remembered how her oldest granddaughter used to trace the lines on her wrinkled hands and ask, "Why do your fingers look like rivers?" She remembered the Christmas when all 5 grandchildren had stayed over, filling the house with giggles and cookie crumbs. And she remembered how, slowly, the visits stopped. The calls grew less frequent. Then nothing. Still, she knitted. Not because she expected them to return, but because, in the quiet rhythm of the thread, she could keep the memories alive. As autumn rolled in, the staff at Rosefield began preparing for their annual Family Day, a bittersweet event for many. For residents with loving families, it meant a day of laughter, hugs, and flowers. For others, it meant a sharper kind of silence. Mary, as always, asked for nothing. She watched the decorations go up with mild amusement and even complimented the paper leaves the nurse's aide had taped to the hallway walls. But when asked if anyone would be visiting her that weekend, she just shook her head and said, "No need." Still, on the morning of Family Day, Mary dressed with more care than usual. She wore a soft lavender cardigan, not one of her own creations, but something her late husband had gifted her many years ago. She dabbed a hint of rosewater on her wrists. And she carried not 1 but 5 folded blankets to the staff desk. "These need to be mailed," she said, gently placing them down. "I've written the addresses inside each one." The nurse on duty, a young woman named Kelly, looked confused. "Ma'am, are these for family?" Mary nodded once. "I didn't know you still kept in touch with them." "I don't," Mary said, "but it doesn't mean they shouldn't be warm." She turned without another word and returned to her window seat, where she began a 6th blanket in rich tones of burgundy and gold. Kelly later peeked into one of the packages. Inside, neatly folded, was the blanket. Tucked on top was a handwritten note in beautiful cursive. It read simply, "For Lucy, I hope your dreams are still as big as they were when you were 6. That evening, Kelly shared what she'd seen with the other staff. Some were touched. Others were surprised that Mary had any contact with her family at all. A few wondered if the notes would even reach the right people. Had the addresses changed? Did they still care? But no one questioned that Mary cared. Deeply. It was 2 weeks later when the first letter arrived. Not for Mary, but addressed from one of her grandchildren. It came in a thick, slightly wrinkled envelope, the handwriting hesitant. It was from Lucy, now 27, living in a different state. She wrote, "I don't know if Grandma will read this or if someone else is opening her mail for her, but I received the blanket. I cried for an hour. I didn't even realize how much I missed her until I held it. I thought she'd forgotten about me. Or worse, that she didn't want to remember me. Please tell her thank you. I'm flying out next weekend. I want to see her, if she'll let me." Kelly read the letter twice, tears prickling her eyes. She printed it out and placed it on Mary's nightstand before breakfast. Mary said nothing when she saw it, but she smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in a very long while. That weekend, Lucy came. She brought flowers and pictures and a heart full of guilt. Mary welcomed her with a calm grace. No accusations, no lectures. Just a long, warm hug, as if no time had passed at all. Word spread quickly. The staff watched as, over the next few weeks, more letters arrived. Then more blankets disappeared from storage. One by one, Mary's grown grandchildren began to reappear. Some shy, others awkward, a few openly emotional. Each received their blanket. Each read a personal message. Each had to confront what they had let slip away. The next to arrive was Thomas, the eldest grandson. He came mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, unannounced. He wore a suit as if trying to armor himself in formality. He held his hands stiffly at his sides, uncertain whether to knock on her door or just turn around and leave. When Mary opened it, she stared at him for a long moment. Then, she stepped aside. "You look tired," she said gently. "I am," Thomas replied, voice tight. "I didn't think you'd let me in. I didn't think you'd come." He sat across from her in the small chair near the window, the one she always left empty. He didn't know it had been saved for him all along. They didn't speak for a while. The room was filled with the soft clicking of needles as Mary continued to knit, her fingers never stopping, even as her eyes watched him. Thomas finally broke the silence. "I thought you hated me." Mary didn't flinch. "Why?" "I never called. I never came back after college. I married without telling you. I was ashamed. I told myself you were just old, that you wouldn't notice or care." Mary's hands paused only briefly. "Of course I noticed. But it wasn't my job to chase you. It was your job to remember where you came from." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. "I forgot for too long. I think I wanted to forget. You reminded me of everything I didn't do right." "You still came," she said softly, finishing her row. "That's something." Thomas broke down then, not loudly, but like a man who hadn't let himself feel in years. Mary reached across the table and placed her hand on his. It was the most affection he'd received from her in decades, and it undid him. In the weeks that followed, Mary's room became a quiet place of reconciliation. Her grandchildren came not all at once, but like waves, some just curious, others seeking forgiveness. Some came for closure. A few came, Mary suspected, out of guilt. One granddaughter, Elise, hadn't seen Mary since she was a teenager. She stood in the doorway for 10 minutes before stepping inside. "I didn't even know if you were still alive," Elise admitted. "I wasn't sure either," Mary said with a wry smile. Elise sat on the floor next to the bed, legs crossed like she used to as a child. "Why do you send the blanket? After all this time?" Mary thought a moment. "Because even when someone lets go of you, you don't have to let go of them. Not entirely." That night, Elise slept in a guest cot at the care home, curled up in her blanket like she had as a child. The staff walked by her room and saw Mary watching her with tearful eyes. Mary continued to knit, though her hands began to tremble more often. Her vision blurred in the evenings. The lines of color she once wove with precision began to wander. But she didn't stop. One morning, Kelly found her dozing in her chair, a half-finished blanket in her lap. She looked peaceful, like someone who'd been tired for a long time and had finally allowed herself to rest. Mary didn't wake up again. She passed away quietly that night, surrounded not by loneliness, but by the quiet love she had reawakened in her final months. On the shelf near her bed was the last blanket she had been working on. Tucked beneath it, a note that read, "To the one I never got to meet. I hope this keeps you warm until someone tells you where you came from." No one knew for sure whom it was meant for. Maybe a great-grandchild. Maybe someone yet to arrive. But the note and the blanket were placed in a memory box at Rosefield, where future generations could see it and wonder. After Mary passed, the mood at Rosefield changed subtly. Not immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably. Her empty window seat remained untouched for weeks. Staff couldn't bring themselves to reassign the spot. The blanket she had last worked on stayed folded in her chair, needles tucked neatly beneath the unfinished row, as if waiting for hands that would never return. The grandchildren, once strangers to the home, now visited more frequently, not just to mourn, but to connect. Lucy began volunteering twice a week, helping with art activities. Thomas returned with his son, showing him the garden and telling stories about a childhood he once tried to forget. And Elise brought yarn. She had never knitted before. But she asked Kelly to teach her. And together they began small. A square, then a row, then a patchwork. It wasn't perfect and not by a long shot, but Elise smiled through the dropped stitches and the uneven tension. "It's not about perfection," she said once. "It's about staying connected." She taught us that. One evening, the family gathered at Rosefield for a small memorial. Not a formal service, just a circle of chairs, a few shared memories, and a table full of blankets. Each grandchild had brought theirs, some worn already from use, others still crisp and untouched. They arranged them like tapestries, side by side, a living quilt of memory. No one cried loudly. But the silence in the room was thick with meaning. A few days after the memorial, Kelly was cleaning out Mary's room when she discovered a small tin box tucked behind a stack of books. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed, all stamped, none sent. Each letter was folded carefully and sealed in an envelope with a child's name written on it. Lucy, Thomas, Elise, but also names the staff hadn't heard before. Grandchildren, maybe, or perhaps nieces, nephews, even children she'd once babysat or taught. Kelly sat down and opened one at random. It was addressed to Aaron, and the handwriting trembled more than usual. "I don't know where you are anymore. I hope you're not angry. I tried to stay in your life. I tried to be the kind of grandmother you deserved. But you moved too fast, and I stayed in place. That's not your fault. I'll keep knitting, just in case you ever remember what it felt like to be held by me." The letters were filled with sorrow, hope, longing, pieces of a woman who had loved more than she had been loved back. Kelly didn't know what to do with them. She brought them to the director, who decided to keep them in the home's private archive, a quiet testament to the resident whose story had touched them all. Months passed. The seasons turned. The window by the courtyard where Mary used to sit was now occasionally taken by other residents, but none stayed as long or with such purpose. Elise finished her first blanket by winter. It wasn't as intricate as Mary's, but it was warm, soft, and full of effort. She donated it to a local children's shelter, attaching a note that read, "Made with love, in memory of someone who believed warmth could reach across years." Soon, other families began to notice. The knitting corner at Rosefield grew. Yarn donations increased. Visitors sat longer, asked more questions. Some even started bringing their own projects, not just knitting, but sketching, letter writing, journaling. It became a quiet movement to remember, to reflect, to reconnect. Mary's story, once silent, had begun to ripple outward. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when a letter arrived at Rosefield, addressed simply to "the woman who made the blanket." No return address. The handwriting was youthful, hesitant. Inside was a short, carefully written message. "I don't know her name. I just know I got this blanket in the mail a few months ago. My mom said it was from an old lady named Mary. It's green and yellow. I sleep with it every night. It makes me feel safe. I never had a grandma, but I think if I did, she'd be like her. Tell her thank you." The letter was signed, Aaron, age 9. The staff stared at it in disbelief. The unfinished blanket in Mary's room had the name Aaron on the note tucked beneath it, the same name that had been on the letter Kelly read from the tin box weeks earlier. But Mary had never mentioned a young Aaron. No one knew who the child was. The address from the package had apparently been correct, though, sent out with the batch she gave to Kelly just before Family Day. Kelly stood for a long time by Mary's window that evening, the letter in her hands. A child she'd never met now carried the warmth of a woman he never knew. Spring returned to Rosefield. The garden Mary once overlooked had begun to bloom again, daffodils, tulips, shy crocuses peeking from the soil. The window seat, which had long remained respectfully empty, was eventually filled, not by a person, but by a small display: a photograph of Mary knitting, her last unfinished blanket beneath a glass cover, and the framed letter from Aaron beside it. Visitors often paused there. Some asked who she was. Others said nothing at all, simply resting in the quiet comfort of her memory. One rainy afternoon, a local reporter came by to do a story on intergenerational care. When she passed Mary's display, she stopped, read the letter, and blinked away tears. This is what people forget," she whispered. "The little legacies." The article that followed featured a full page titled, "Blankets of Grace: How One Woman Wove Her Way Back into Her Family's Heart." Within a week, donations poured in to support Rosefield's new memory arts program. Elderly residents began writing memory letters. Some started painting. Others, inspired by Mary's story, took up knitting for the first time in decades. Elise was the one who suggested it. "A quilt," she said one day, standing in the common room. "Made from all our pieces, every resident, every story, one patch per person." The staff embraced the idea. Families sent in fabric from old clothes, scarves, ties, anything meaningful. Each square was embroidered or painted with a name and a memory. Mary's square was made from her last unfinished blanket. In the center, stitched in gold thread, were the words, "She remembered us, even when we forgot her." The final quilt stretched across 2 walls in the home's new activity center. People came from neighboring towns just to see it. Teachers brought students. Reporters returned for follow-up stories. The quilt became a landmark, not just of craft, but of connection. One summer morning, a boy about 10 years old walked through Rosefield's front doors, holding a green and yellow blanket under one arm. He had messy hair, wide eyes, and a mother trailing behind him with a look of quiet encouragement. Kelly greeted them. "Can I help you?" The boy nodded. "My name's Aaron. I wanted to see the place where the blanket came from." Kelly froze, then smiled. She led them to the display and then to the quilt. Aaron stood in front of Mary's name for a long time. "She made this?" "She did. She didn't even know me. She didn't have to." Aaron sat in Mary's old chair, the blanket in his lap. He didn't speak for several minutes. When he finally did, he asked, "Can I learn to knit?" Kelly knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. "Of course." Aaron became a regular visitor. What started as a one-time trip became a weekly routine. Every Thursday afternoon, he'd come after school, blanket in tow, and settle into the craft room at Rosefield. He struggled at first. His hands were small, and the needles awkward. But he was determined. The older residents, especially a woman named Ethel, took to him instantly. She reminded him to be patient with the yarn. "It's like people," she said. "You rush. It tangles. You listen. It flows." Aaron would nod solemnly, concentrating on each stitch as if it were a spell. The first thing he made was a tiny square, crooked, full of holes. He held it up with pride. "I'm going to make one for her," he told Kelly. "For Mary?" He nodded. "I know she's gone, but I still want to, just in case." Word of Mary's story, and Aaron's role in it, continued to spread. A local high school partnered with Rosefield to launch an intergenerational mentorship program. Teenagers began visiting residents regularly, not just to help, but to listen. Some residents even began teaching classes: baking, chess, poetry, and of course, knitting. The story was picked up by a national magazine. The headline read, "The Blanket That Bridged the Years." With it came hundreds of letters, from strangers, families, even teachers, asking for permission to share Mary's story in their classrooms. One letter written by a prison inmate stood out. "Reading about Mary reminded me of the grandmother I never visited. I'm starting a knitting group here. Thank you for showing me it's not too late to change the pattern." Kelly couldn't stop thinking about Mary's unsent letters. With the family's blessing, she decided to scan and copy each one. Then, over the course of several months, she tracked down as many recipients as she could, using addresses from old Christmas cards Mary had saved and a bit of help from a volunteer genealogist. Not all letters reached their intended reader. Some had moved, some had passed, but a surprising number wrote back. Many didn't even realize Mary had remembered them. Some were moved to tears. One letter simply said, "I read it 3 times. I cried. I read it again. Thank you." I'm coming to visit next month. And they did. By winter, Rosefield had more visitors than ever before. One frosty afternoon, the home hosted a gathering titled Letters and Legacies. Dozens of people who had once received, or should have received, a blanket from Mary attended. There were children holding patchwork scarves. Elderly men with mismatched socks knit years ago. A young woman brought her newborn wrapped in one of Mary's final blankets. It wasn't just a memorial anymore. It was a living tribute. Aaron, now confident with his needles, stood beside the quilt display with his newest creation, a full scarf he had knit himself. The tag read, "For someone who believed in warmth." Weeks later, a man named Daniel arrived. He didn't smile when he entered, didn't speak much at first. He was in his late 60s with tired eyes and calloused hands. When Kelly greeted him, he simply said, I think she was my mother." Daniel had been estranged from Mary for nearly 30 years. No one at Rosefield had even known he existed. He walked slowly through the halls, pausing at her display, at the garden, at her quilt square. Then he turned to Kelly and asked, Did she talk about me?" Kelly hesitated, then nodded. "She didn't forget you." Tears welled in his eyes. "She said she stayed in one place too long," he whispered. "That's why I left. I didn't know." He didn't finish. But that night, he asked for one thing: to sleep in her room. Just once. Permission was granted. He sat in the same chair she used to knit in, blanket over his lap, staring out into the night for hours. Inspired by Mary, the home established a permanent program, the Mary Project. Its goal was simple: to ensure that every resident, no matter how alone, left something behind for the world to remember them by. Some wrote books, others planted flowers, many took up fiber arts, even in their final months. The project expanded into schools, libraries, hospitals. Community centers displayed quilts made by the residents. At the bottom of each panel was a quote from Mary's recovered journal: "We do not vanish." We unravel slowly into those we touched. Years passed. Aaron grew older. He visited less, but always wrote. He sent photos of his latest work: hats, scarves, socks. On his 18th birthday, he returned to Rosefield with a gift: a blanket. It was deep green, like the one Mary made for him, with golden thread interwoven throughout. The pattern was different and modern, even complex, but the warmth was the same. He laid it on Mary's chair, now faded with time. "For her," he whispered, "and for the next person who sits here." One day, a new resident moved into Rosefield. Her name was Lily. She was quiet, uncertain, and afraid. Her first day, she wandered into the craft room, where a group of residents were laughing and knitting together. On the back of one chair, she found a note: "This seat is for anyone who believes warmth can still reach them." She smiled and sat down.